So many people, many people, black folks included, have been conditioned by Western education systems to treat authority as something that comes from institutions, journals, courts, or credentialed experts, not the actual content of evidence being presented. So, even when you cite laws, dates, data, primary documents, and historical evidence, they still reflexively ask for sources because they were trained to outsource judgment rather than evaluate information critically. This reflex is a product of epistemic whitewashing. Colonial knowledge systems taught people to distrust oral tradition, lived scholarship, and non-Western historiography, while elevating white-dominated institutions as final arbiters of truth. So, a white face, university logo, or mainstream publication becomes a psychological permission slip to believe what's already been proven. As a result, asking for sources often isn't about rigor, but about internalized doubt, where people subconsciously seek validation from the very power structures that historically erased, distorted, or gatekept black knowledge in the first place. So, accepting money or highly publicized donations from powerful white people or influencers in response to racism often functions as performative allyship, where financial gestures replace accountability and structural change, allowing harmful narratives and unequal power dynamics to continue untouched. An issue long documented since the post-civil rights era, when symbolic integration and corporate philanthropy expanded, even as enforcement of the Civil Rights Act of 1964 and the Fair Housing Act of 1968, and voting protections under the Voting Rights Act of 1965 were weakened through policy rollbacks and court decisions. Figures such as Mr. Beast, Aiden Ross, FaZe Banks, Steve will do it, Joe Rogan, Elon Musk, and many others in the influencer economy have faced repeated public criticism for hosting, platforming, or failing to meaningfully challenge racist rhetorics, extremist guests, or racially harmful stereotypes, or just flat out racism from them themselves within their content ecosystems. When this is followed by donations to black causes or businesses without sustained education, public correction, or changes in content standards, scholars describe the result as moral licensing. Money acting as a reputational shield that quiets criticism while ignorance continues to spread, especially to children and audiences with limited media literacy. Historically, and legally, progress has never come from payouts, but from enforced deeds. Court ordered desegregation after Brown versus Board of Education. Federal oversight won through the civil rights movements, and policy-driven reforms. Showing that one time or two time or a couple time donations are not reparative justice or giving back to the hood, and y'all damn show not extorting them niggas. That shit be tax write-offs. Anyway, stupid nigga, that only works on niggas that don't pay taxes, but often transactional tools that preserve influence, deflect responsibility, and delay the deeper enforced changes required to prevent long-term societal harm rather than temporarily silence opposition. You understand? So, black people are often conditioned to believe that any opportunity we receive is a rare exception that must be earned in isolation, not shared or extended, because centuries of enslavement, segregation, and state violence deliberately destroyed black family wealth, criminalized black corporation, and framed black collective advancement as unfair, corrupt, or handouts. While white families were legally allowed and encouraged to practice inheritance, family businesses, and political nepotism without stigma. This conditioning is reinforced through respectability politics, anti-black stereotypes about undeservingness, and survival trauma, which makes many black people internalize the lie that helping your children, relatives, or community is morally wrong, unless they suffer first, even though every dominant group on earth advances primarily through protected networks, parental investment, and intergenerational transfer of resources. The go do it yourself or do it all on your own or depend on yourself mentality is especially harmful for an already oppressed group because it isolates individuals, fragments families, and prevents wealth building and resets progress back to zero every single generation. Ensuring that systemic inequality remains intact while individuals are blamed for outcomes that were structurally engineered. At its core, discouraging righteous black interdependence is not about fairness or merit. It is a control mechanism that keeps black success temporary, solitary, and non-reproducible, instead of stable, inherited, and collective. Black people can be prejudiced, but they cannot be racist. Prejudice means holding personal bias or negative attitudes towards other groups, but not racist in the same structural way white people have historically been. Because racism is not merely individual hostility, it is prejudice plus institutional power. Meaning the ability to enforce bias through laws, policies, economics, media control, violence, and social systems that shape life outcomes on a mass scale. In societies formed through European colonization and white supremacy, white people collectively controlled and often still disproportionately control governments, courts, policing, housing, education, finance, and cultural narratives, allowing anti-black beliefs to be embedded into systems like slavery, Jim Crow, redlining, schools, mass incarceration, medical neglect, and generational wealth theft. Power black people have never possessed over whites. This is why relying on Google or dictionary definitions is misleading. Because they reflect popular usage, not academic precision. When a word is misused by the majority for decades, it becomes normalized as the new definition, even if it erases power dynamics. So sociological and historical frameworks make clear that while black people can be personally biased, racism functions structurally and asymmetrically from dominant groups onto oppressed ones. You understand? So people deny that indigenous and African languages were deliberately stripped during slavery and colonization because they focus on rare survivals while ignoring the overwhelming legal, educational, and institutional record, proving intentional suppression. Beginning with African enslavement under laws like the Barbados Slave Code of 1661, Virginia Slave Codes of 1705, and the South Carolina Negro Act of 1740, passed after the 1739 Stono Rebellion, where Africans used shared language to organize, which criminalized African assembly, communication, drumming, and cultural expression, while plantation policies documented in sources like Edward Long's History of Jamaica 1774 show enslavers intentionally mixing Africans from different ethnic linguistic groups. Examples: Igbo, Akan, Yoruba, Congo, and Namandi, to prevent language continuity, reinforced by missionary instruction that only permitted literacy through European language. Religious texts such as the King James Bible, the Book of Common Prayers, and and Catholic catechisms that labeled African languages as pagan and forbidden. Similarly, indigenous language destruction was formalized through state power with the Spanish Royal Decree of 1770 per King Charles III, mandating Spanish as the sole legal language in colonial governance and education. Followed in the United States by the Civilization Fund Act of 1819 and the Indian Removal Act of 1830, which fractured linguistic communities, culminating in the boarding school system of 1879 through 1969. Starting with the Carlisle Indian Industrial School of 1879 under Richard Henry Pratt's explicit doctrine: kill the Indian, save the man. Alongside institutions like the Haskell Institute of 1884, the Chilocco Indian Agricultural School of 1884, and the Chamawa Indian School of 1880, and the Phoenix Indian School of 1891, where Native children were beaten, isolated, starved, or humiliated for speaking their languages, and forced to learn exclusively through English-only curricula, using texts like McGuffey readers, Christian catechisms, and vocational manuals, all documented in school punishment logs, missionary reports, and federal records, and the 1928 Merriam Report, making it historically false to argue that a few surviving languages nullify the rule, since those survivals exist precisely because people resisted a system explicitly designed by law, school, church, and force to erase language as a means of identity, resistance, and memory. You understand? So Black Americans are not voluntary immigrants. Our ancestors were either forcibly trafficked into the Americas through the transatlantic slave trade, or had their indigenous and Afro-indigenous identities deliberately erased through law, census manipulation, and racial reclassification designed to serve colonial power. Long before Columbus, Africans were elite navigators, and he did not reach the Americas without black expertise, including Pedro Alonzo Nino, a Moorish pilot of African descent on the Santa Maria. While Columbus's own October 1492 journal, recorded by Bartolome de las Casas, documents Taino accounts of other black men carrying metal-tipped spears, establishing African Atlantic presence prior to European conquest. What erased Afro-Indigenous peoples was paper genocide through law, including Virginia's 1662 Partis-Equator Ventrum, the 1705 Slave Codes, and the 1790 Neutralization Act. Then we have the 1830 Indian Removal Act. Then we have the 1887 Dawes Act. Then we have the 1898 Curtis Act. Then we have the 1924 Indian Citizenship Act. Oh, you thought I was done? Of course not. Then we have census reclassifications. Then we have boarding schools. Then we have the 1950 through 1970 termination policies, all documented by the Native American Rights Fund. All of which deliberately stripped black Native communities of land, language, and legal recognition. Enslaved population growth itself was also manufactured through forced breeding, routine rape by slaveholders, coerced pairings, and the domestic slave trade that broke families apart and redistributed people across regions. While modern DNA and ancestry tests are incapable of defining nationhood, culture, or historical experience, and are now misused to override documented kinship and legal history, functioning as a contemporary extension of the same racial erasure layered on top of slavery, Jim Crow, redlining, mass incarceration, land theft, and the ongoing refusal to repair the harm. It's your boy. So the out of Africa theory is supported by genetics, fossils, and climate science, because the oldest human remains, the highest genetic diversity, and the earliest tool cultures all come from East and Southern Africa, proving that Homo sapiens evolved there long before spreading across the world. Early humans were dark-skinned and heavily melanated because high UV radiation in Africa naturally selected for melanin, which protects DNA, folate, and skin integrity. And no other region had the heat, UV intensity, and year-round sun exposure to produce and maintain that level of pigmentation. So even if European scientists helped popularize the theory, the evidence comes from African soil, African fossils, and African DNA, not from white imagination or invention. So, in short, humans originated in Africa. They were black, and every population outside of Africa comes from those original melanated ancestors. You understand? So gluttony, greed, and lust are especially harmful to black communities because history and policy show we were deliberately targeted with hyper-processed foods, addictive substances, and hypersexualized media, and predatory consumer systems that overstimulate desire while draining discipline, leading to higher rates of obesity, diabetes, heart disease, depression, and shortened life expectancy. Outcomes documented by the CDC and the NIH, and structurally reinforced through redlining, food deserts, and permissive advertising frameworks tracked by the USDA and federal housing policy. From a neurological and psychological standpoint, chronic overconsumption and sexual overstimulation dysregulate dopamine and stress symptoms, reducing focus, impulse control, and long-term planning, while increasing anxiety and burnout. Whereas physically active, purpose-driven lifestyles are constantly shown to improve executive function, mood regulation, and resilience, aligning with the historical reality that African and African descended societies were labor skilled, mobile, and agriculturally productive, and community oriented, rather than sedentary and consumption driven. Scriptures like do not join those who gorge themselves per Proverbs 23:20-21. Then we have scriptures like flee sexual immorality, 1 Corinthians 6:18-20. Then we have the love of money is the root of all kinds of evil, 1 Timothy 6:9-10. And your body is a temple, 1 Corinthians 6:19. Combined with public health research and social science on the same conclusion. Self-control strengthens mental clarity, physical vitality, and family stability and collective progress, while unchecked indulgence weakens individuals and stalls community advancements. You understand? So since I keep seeing stupid ass motherfuckers say Africans, as in fellow melanated people, sold other Africans into slavery. That's not true, but let's get into what it is. The historical record shows that the earliest large-scale enslavement of Africans was driven by, guess who? Arab expansionists. Empires beginning in the 7th century, where newly Arabized non-black ruling elites enslaved original black Arabs and other Africans through the trans-Saharan, Red Sea, and Indian Ocean slave trades, legally justified by interpretations of Islamic law that permitted enslavement of non-Muslims and increasingly racialized blackness over time, per the Bach Treaty of 652 CE, compelling Nubia to deliver enslaved black Africans annually. A process that marked a clear shift from Afro-Semitic origins toward anti-black racial hierarchies. Centuries later, European Christians adopted and stole and intensified this framework. Through Pope Nicholas V's Papa Bull Dom Diversas of 1452 and Romanos Pontifex of 1455. And technically, while they were doing all of this, they were indentured servants. So this proves that white slavery was nothing like black slavery, too, by the way. Now, Let's get back to the truth. Which authorized permanent African enslavement and transformed slavery into a hereditary, race-based, lifelong chattel system, fundamentally different from earlier non-hereditary, non-racialized forms of servitude or so-called white slavery. Later codified in laws like the Barbados Slave Codes of 1661 and the Virginia Slave Codes of 1705. While some African societies were coerced into supplying prisoners of war, this occurred under foreign demand, weaponized trade dependency, deception, and treaty manipulation that collapsed legalized conflicts into export pipelines, including region-specific systems such as Somali coastal slavery and Ethiopian Sudanese routes and Senegambian wars. And because Arab and European empires forcibly relocated Africans across continents and around countries for centuries, renaming them, banning languages, destroying kinship records, and deliberately mixing ethnic groups, millions of Africans today cannot trace their true lineages, and they are going around acting like something they aren't. Which was a designed outcome of colonization rather than an African created system. So basically, black people didn't have a choice to sell other blacks into slavery because Arabs and Europeans already wrote it into fucking law. Appreciate you. So since I keep seeing people say if a black person obtain a position of power and they fire a white person for being white, that's racist. Nigga, no the fuck it's not. Shut your punk pussy ass up, nigga. Now let me tell you the truth. Racism is not just individual prejudice. It is prejudice backed by systemic power. And white people collectively built, controlled, and benefited from institutions that enforced racial hierarchy for centuries. Meaning, black people, even in positions of authority, are still operating inside systems designed around white advantage. When black people make race-conscious decisions within those spaces, it functions as corrective or protective action against ongoing inequality. Not the creation of a new racial caste, because it lacks the historical continuity, institutional dominance, and generational harm that define white racism. Therefore, black advancement does not require white inclusion or approval. And choosing to center black people after centuries of exclusion is not discrimination. It is self-determination and repair. You understand? Okay, don't forgive or don't forget, bitch, I'ma hold a grudge. Why you think you know me, nigga? You